Welcome to tonight's presentation, Rockets and Resolve, Canadian Reflections from Israel. I'm Karen Storwick, the Vice President and Director of Communications for RAUSI, the Royal Alberta United Services Institute. For those of you unfamiliar with RAUSI, we are a Canadian-based forum for discussions on trending topics as they relate to global security and defense. Our history dates back to 1920 when RAUSI began as a think tank and then evolved into a service organization for veterans in the decades following the World Wars. RAUSI has recently evolved back into a think tank, publishing original articles, generating discussion on social media platforms, and hosting a speaker series to amplify discourse on security and defense. Tonight's presentation is part of our Rocky Mountain Conference on Security and Defense series. And in June, we will be introducing a new youth speaker series, The Briefing Room, Young Minds, Big Ideas. So please stay tuned for that. Tonight's presentation will be approximately 30 to 35 minutes, and there will be a Q&A following the presentation. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to Joe, our president, and he will introduce our speakers. Thank you and enjoy the presentation.
Thanks very much, Karen. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. This is a special treat tonight because this is the first time we will have had 3 people on the panel. So this is a pretty neat event for RAUSI. The panel tonight is comprised of people from both the military, the public service, and the policy sphere. So it is a broad-based panel. The individuals have just spent a week in Israel, where they spoke directly with government officials, members of the Israeli Defense Force, and civilians across the entire range of perspectives. They're not dealing in theory, they're dealing in real life. Our first speaker is going to be Captain Navy Cal Bricker, who, among other things, had 3 tours in Afghanistan. He holds a doctorate in international relations and is currently a fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs. Cal is going to be, and Cal, please correct me if I'm wrong, going to be bringing more of a strategic lens, the 30,000 feet perspective, and discussing the notion of whether or not there is a case to be made for statehood or not, and what a Palestinian state might look like. He will be followed in turn by Lieutenant Navy Kevin Young, former member of Parliament and co-founder of the Delphic Research Group. Kevin is going to be talking about, so what does all this mean for Canada? Kevin will be then followed by Quentin Innis, who has, among other things, tours in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and most recently, Chief of Operations for Task Force Latvia. He is going to be talking about the complexity beneath the headlines, drawing on the actual conversations with both Israelis and Palestinians. So, Cal, if I could ask you to please take the floor, and when you're done, hand over to Kevin, and Kevin, in turn, hand over to Quentin, and we'll take it from there and play it off the cuff. Cal, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It will be off the cuff. And I always find that these things work the best when we move into the Q&A and we can get some dialogue going amongst the people that are participating. Thanks so much again for this opportunity. I'm going to not get into that much detail. What I'd like to do is kind of set a context about things that I think all of us are probably thinking about. I know that we certainly thought about these things and discussed these kinds of things on the trip that we all took. But what I'm going to position this more as is a set of provocations and threads that we can choose to pick at in terms of trying to engage this, because it's such a complex, multidimensional, difficult Gordian knot that we find ourselves in. But we've always kind of found ourselves in the Middle East, although I think at this time it's a little more acute and present for folks than it probably has been, probably since, I'm not sure, 73, 60. I mean, we pick your date, but we certainly find ourselves in a moment, and it's a moment with more moving parts than I think I can think of in any other moment that we've had in the Middle East over the last, again, pick your time period, but we need to consider Iran and its proxies and what they're up to. We hear about it every day. Washington and the Abraham Accords. What President Trump gets up tomorrow morning and says. None of us can predict, but we do know it's going to be a factor. Syrian regime change, which is a brand new feature that a year ago nobody could have seen coming. Diaspora politics in the West. And I think we need to consider that. And I'm sure Kevin's going to touch on it, and the impact that it's having on decision making in Western democracies, not just in Canada, but all over the world. China and Russia. What role do they play in all of this? They're lurking around the sidelines and actually getting involved in much of what we're seeing going on. And then there's internal Israeli divisions. Israel is far from a monolith and probably one of the most vibrant democracies in the world. And you cannot get all Israelis to agree that that today is Wednesday. Right. So, or Thursday or whatever the hell. I'm in Moncton. I'm kind of lost in my time zones here. Wednesday. So it's a very, very complex, fraught environment. And, we're seeing it played out in university campuses. We're seeing it playing out in media. We're seeing it play out in amongst different interest groups. We're seeing it playing out in the streets in many Western democracies in a way that we've never seen before. Certainly not about this issue. We've seen it on other things, but on the Middle East and the situation we find ourselves dealing with in Gaza, certainly not that. So another question is the old saw about the two-state solution is really being put to the test. Have the Palestinians ever genuinely believed in it? And you can make an argument you can make a good argument either way on that. And I'm pleased to engage that in the Q&A if folks have an interest in it. There's a lot of people, if you talk to them in Israel, that would say to you, whether you want to accept it or not, this is what they believe, that they had their state. They had it in Gaza. They got it in 2005, and in 2006 they voted in Hamas and have spent the rest of the time between. What I'm saying is not controversial. I mean, there's all kinds of people that this is not original thinking, that would say to you that they spent the rest of their time planning the attack that happened on October 7th and building the infrastructure to make it happen. There's other people that would say they never really got a genuine chance at it. So, I mean, that's again something that I think we need to discuss. And following on that, do they actually have an interest now? And if they do have an interest now, who speaks for the Palestinians? Because if you had an election in Gaza or the West Bank tomorrow, I think it's better than even odds that you'd find that Hamas would win. So, what are we dealing with when we're talking about dealing with a political entity there? How would we manage that? What role do other Arab nations have, and other stakeholders in that in the Middle East have, in if a Palestinian state is to be brought forward, in constructing that state and working to make it successful? It's a big question, and nobody really seems to want to answer it. And I'll get back to that in a second. And has this notion of a Palestinian state or a two-state solution evaporated now in Israel, based on what we talk to people about? And all you needed to go to is Kfar Aza and some of these other places that we were near Oz and other places where the most liberal people in the country, who were considered the Palestinians' neighbors, were the ones that were savaged on October 7th. And they were the ones that were carrying that mantle. And you got to wonder if there's if that flame is still burning there. Based on what I saw, I'm sure Kevin and Quentin are going to have some views on this. I would say that if it's not out, it's close to out. And at the bottom of this one, to me, is this a solution that only exists in the minds of Western liberals? Do the actual actors in those areas have they ever genuinely believed that this was something that could happen? It's a good question to ask. For Canada, and Kevin, I know, is going to touch on this in more detail. All of this confusion was on full display this week. Okay, there's a clear break with Israel, and it's been going on for a while now, but it really happened this week, where you'll see that the Israelis think that, and if you talk to them, think that a ceasefire is absolutely incompatible with defeating Hamas. So anybody that proposes a ceasefire is not really interested in supporting Israel's effort to bring peace in the way they think they need to bring it to that area. And interestingly enough, nobody really has any other kind of notion about how that would be made to happen. If it's not a ceasefire, what is it? If you're not going to allow them to defeat Hamas, what is it? Well, nobody really has any answers. All they do is they call for a ceasefire. And Canada did it again this week, as did England, as did France. A two-state solution is again proposed as if it's obvious and axiomatic. It's not obvious and axiomatic to anybody in the area, I can tell you. Okay, Canada threatens sanctions. Again, like what? We've already said that we're going to not sell them any military capability. So what sanctions do they have in mind? I'd be very interested to hear what that is. And overlaying all of this decision making is the impact of diaspora politics in this country, particularly in the Liberal Party right now. And the Tories are not immune from this. And NDP certainly are not immune to it. But diaspora politics is affecting this country in a way that I think it never has before. It's another issue for us to consider. So there's a lot to ponder here. And I know that Kevin and Quentin are going to provide some additional context and touch on some things that I haven't. But I'd be happy to engage in the Q&A and take a dive down into any of these elements that I've touched on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Cal. So I'll just add really quickly, because you mentioned Kibbutz Kfar Raza, which is what we visited as well. Folks may be aware that on October 7th, there was also the Nova Festival, which was attacked and over 400 people were murdered there. And I think it's important to point out that both the kibbutzes as well as Nova Festival were probably the most left-leaning people who sought peace. They were the strongest advocates. And what was immensely tragic, and we heard a story at Kibbutz Kfar Aza, was that these were individuals that were taking sick Palestinians to the hospital, that they were essentially making work opportunities so that they could employ Palestinians, people from Gaza. And what was immensely tragic was that the people who they were helping were using those occasions to collect intelligence for the attack. So what happened in Kibbutz Kfar Aza was they had identified where the armory was for the 8 Civil Guard members, so that when the attack was happening on October 7th, a paraglider glided in and landed on the roof of a building that overlooked the armory. And the snipers took out each and every single member of the Civil Guard. And I think the greatest advocates for the two-state solution from within Israel have, unfortunately, so many have been murdered. And it has left a mark, obviously, on the nation. Now, what does this mean for Canada? It's a conflict that's happening 8,000 kilometers away. But I think it's important to note that 8 Canadians were murdered on October 7th, 4 of which were at the Nova Festival. And of the 8, 1 continues to be held hostage. Judy Weinstein, she was a peace advocate. But she is, unfortunately, no longer with us. She was murdered. But they continue to hold her body hostage. And these are the individuals that, unfortunately, some voices here on the streets of our cities, of our campuses, are advocating for and championing, and in some respects, even glorifying. Last summer, I think it's important to point out that with every incident that we've seen of violence, which started with words, left unaddressed and unresponded to, which is something that unfortunately we've been particularly bad at in Toronto, has led to escalation. I've had businesses that were in the riding I represented as a member of parliament that were first targeted for simple basic harassment. And it was unaddressed and largely uncondemned. In Toronto, we have 25 members of parliament, 25 members of provincial parliament or MLAs, and 25 city councillors and the mayor. And unfortunately, of the 76, I could count on one hand how many people would condemn what are clearly acts that are driven by anti-Semitism. No other businesses were targeted along a particular protest route, except those that were identified as owned by Jews. And when the majority of public office holders left that largely unaddressed, it escalated and went to vandalism. And that vandalism led to graffiti. And we have seen Toronto schools, elementary schools for Jewish girls shot at. We've seen acts of arson and firebombing towards synagogues. And our campuses have been occupied. This is where I think our folks here in Ontario could have taken a lot from how Alberta was quick and swift in action and ensuring that they didn't put down stakes at any particular campus. Cal had talked about diaspora politics. There is, I think, an important distinction that the majority of our national leaders seem to have seem to confuse or be able to unable to delineate, which is that no community, including the Muslim community, is a monolith. But unfortunately, some of the largest or most vocal voices, organizations that have named themselves as if they are national representatives of the community, have put forward particular positions that, as someone who has spoken to moderate imams, faith leaders for the Muslim community, for the Islamic faith, who do not agree with those positions. But anybody who has dared to speak up, speaking as someone who has, is vilified. And that vilification goes beyond just social media, beyond just words. My wife and I were followed. My very pregnant wife at the time was stalked. Our home was targeted in our neighborhood with posters that, Kevin supports genocide. And I bring this up not as, a pity story for myself, but to give you a sense of why I, for example, don't blame any moderate members of the Muslim community who don't agree with what the self-proclaimed national advocates and voices are saying, and why they don't speak up, because they see what happens to those who do. And I think that also is an act of intimidation where it leads to public office holders to self-censor. And it's had a real issue now for our country and our democracy. Now, when I went to Israel, and I had also gone to DC, one of the questions that I had was, what does the day after look like? And I think that what I learned there in Israel was the sense was there really is no day after. At least that was the impression that I had gotten. In Canada, having spoken with individuals at Global Affairs and others, there was the belief that there were some organizations like UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, that they had to have a hand in anything moving forward, whether it's a distribution of aid, education, and so on. But this is an organization that is clearly joined at the fanatical hip with Hamas and other terror groups. It is documented that they steal the humanitarian aid funded by our own taxpayer dollars. And the challenge is, from a policy perspective, that there are very few who are willing to speak up, and it remains the policy of this country to continue to fund UNRWA, in spite of the intelligence that has been shared by the Israelis that identify clearly members of UNRWA staff with their employee IDs, with their dates of birth, that show that they are in fact terrorists who have a side gig at UNRWA. There are individuals who are principals of UNRWA schools who allowed their staff to take the day off on October 7th, 2023, so that they could partake in the pillaging and all of the other different atrocities that were committed that day. And so the day after, and the sense at the time, albeit now it's been about 6 months since my conversation in DC, is that UNRWA cannot be at the table, and it needs to be another organization, a coalition led by Middle Eastern countries, signatories likely to the Abraham Accords, where there has already been reform to the education. because the current education within the West Bank, within Gaza, is one where, and the best example for me to provide is in Canada, if you want to teach physics, you use the example of, say, throwing a ball to my friend playing baseball. The example that they use in the Gazan UNRWA textbooks is, I want to fire a rocket at the Israelis. Let's calculate the physics and the angle that we would need to do that. And so there is a reformed Palestinian education curriculum already in Jerusalem that could be used. There are a number of other examples, but there needs to be the political will. And it's not going to happen if you continue to have the UK, France, Canada, and others signing what they said. And I'll just simply conclude that when our government, never mind 3 prominent G7 nations, is thanked by a terrorist group, we're probably on the wrong track. Quentin, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. I've got a number of sort of bullet points to make, and they're based on my observations and my time over there. I spent, after Kevin and Cal went back to Canada, I spent an additional 4 days in East Jerusalem. There's a friend of mine who is at the embassy there. So I stayed with her, and I got a little bit of input from her and her perspective, and then Palestinian perspectives. And I spent a bunch of time walking around Jerusalem talking to Palestinians, predominantly Palestinians. So the first point, Israeli society is cohesive. I mean, notwithstanding Cal's comments about if you ask 3 Israelis for their opinion, you'll get at least 4, because at least one will have at least 2. Much like lawyers, really. The main fissure between the government and the population is about the conduct of the war. It's not about the justification for it. And the Israelis that we spoke to did not blame the IDF, despite the fact that there was pretty clearly an intelligence failure here, or sorry, I wouldn't call it an intelligence failure. I think the intelligence community did what it was supposed to do. I think they were ignored, much as happened in 1973. Morale amongst the troops we talked to is very high, and support from the civilian population was very strong. And an example of this is a distribution point that was set up outside Gaza by civilians on the first day, on the 7th of October. Basically, what happened was 2 helicopters crash landed. The crews that were recovering the helicopters used an intersection as a casualty collection point. People in the village came out, started to help. They brought out generators, they brought out tents, they bought food, they bought water, and that became a permanent thing. And it's still ongoing. The troops stopped there on their way in and out of Gaza, and they can pick up a hot meal, they can pick up coffee, they can get clothing and equipment. So I think the first point, the society is cohesive. Second point, the issue is not binary. It's often portrayed as an Arab-Israeli issue or a Jewish-Muslim issue, and that really simplifies what's going on in the Middle East. Israeli society is composed of Jews, Christians, Druze, and Muslims. There's also a strong connection with the Alawites in Syria. Within Muslim society, you've got Shia and Sunni split because Hamas and Hezbollah are Sunni. Oh, sorry, Hamas and Fatah are Sunni, and Hezbollah is Shia. Then you've got the various Christian communities that are aligned with the Palestinians. So there is such a thing as a Palestinian Christian, and the general consensus is that Fatah, which is largely secular, and Hamas is largely fundamentalist Sunni, don't get along either. The fight's different in each border. Israel's got 5 borders. So Gaza, Lebanon, Golan, Jordan, and Egypt. And the dynamic is different on each of those borders. The problem is different. So the fight in Gaza is very different from the fight that's going on in the north against Hezbollah. Coming on to what Cal said about the 2-state solution, I think the 2-state solution is dead. I don't think there's any trust after the 7th of October, the Al-Aqsa flood operation, as it was called. The status of Jerusalem central to the debate. Jerusalem is a key point for 3 major religions. The Dome of the Rock covers a rock that, if you go back into Jewish history, that's where God gathered the dust for Adam. It's where Abraham almost sacrificed his son. Jesus preached there. In the Muslim tradition, that's where Muhammad, in a dream, flew on a horse to Jerusalem and stepped on that rock and went to heaven and had his audience with Allah and the angels. So it's central to all of those religions. And the status of Jerusalem is going to be a major bone of contention moving forward. Israeli government policy and their objectives are not congruent. The initial Israeli policy was 3 objectives. First one was destroy Hamas's military capability. The second one was ensure the return of the hostages. And the third one was destroy Hamas's governmental capability. Because as Kevin noted, Hamas also forms the government in Gaza. The Israeli government added the return of the civilians in the north to the war aims in September of 24. And then those aims have shifted. And there currently appear to be 5 or 6 aims, mostly concentrated on Gaza. But the big difference is that Israeli politicians are talking about an occupation of Gaza as opposed to what's been going on up till now, which is limited military raids and incursions. There's widespread support for Trump among Israelis, at least when we were there. There was a giant poster thanking Trump in Jerusalem. It's about 6 stories high. And every Israeli that I spoke to, with few exceptions, were pretty happy with Trump. Disappointed, I think, in Harris and Biden, but I think they may be reconsidering that given Trump's latest escapades in the Gulf. And one unanswered question, which we never really got a response to, which is why did Hezbollah not attack? So the fear for the Israelis was fighting a 2-front war. Hezbollah's military capability far exceeds Hamas's military capability, but for whatever reason, Hezbollah stayed out of the war until the Israelis did that targeted attack using their communication system and basically wiped out Hezbollah. And as an example of some of the stats that we've got from the operations in Lebanon, we sat down and talked with a lieutenant colonel who is running one of the artillery battalions, and he talked about 13,000 ATGMs being captured, 2,000 C2 nodes and structures, 24,000 raids on the ground. So the net impact of that was to reduce Hezbollah. So I would argue that the threat from the north is not as strong as it was. And that's why the Israelis are able to focus on the south. They've shifted troops to the south. I'll leave it at that. We're at the bottom of the hour, so I want to leave time for questions. I will pass it back to the moderator for questions. Tom?
Thanks very much, Quentin. But to be fair, I will give 1 or 2 minute supplementals to each of Cal, Kevin, and Quentin before we launch on questions. That's Cal, if you wish. Any last comments?
Yes. So I think Quentin touched and Kevin both touched on a bunch of or a number of very interesting dynamics. I mean, it was such a whirlwind trip. It's hard to it's kind of hard to get your hands around what we were seeing. But one of the things to echo what Quentin was saying, I don't want to confuse people to think that I disagree, because I don't. There is unanimity in Israel about what needs to happen here. Now, there's been some things that have happened in the last couple of weeks. People refusing to show up for reserve duty. There's been some things that are reported, but my sense would be that that's very much on the margins. There's some questions about what to do in the sense of the best way to return the hostages. So you're seeing that animated and discussed in the media. But there's no question that the view there is that this needs to be pushed through to the destruction of Hamas. So if people are waiting for that to change, there's going to need to be a fair amount of other change to cause that to happen, because I don't think the Israelis are going to shrink from that, despite what Canada, France, and England have to say about it.
Cal, thanks very much. Kevin, any last thoughts?
I think what has emerged since October 7th, 2023 is a lot of clear indications around what Israel's foreign policy doctrine is, which is anyone who attacks them they're going to take 10% of your land, and they're going to provide a safety buffer. And I think we saw that the opportunity they saw in Syria to seize Mount Hermon, and which now has given them a much stronger position in the Upper Galilee. The other thing I wanted to just mention for anyone who's interested about that rapid response from Israeli civilians when it came to the 2 helicopters that went down, and how it's essentially become this incredible one-stop shop before Israelis enter Gaza to stop and pick up anything that they might be missing, any kit. And this isn't because the IDF is not good at procurement. I think we can learn a lot from them on that. It's that when you're rapidly equipping over 500,000 reservists, you're just not going to have that much stuff in stores. And they are called, their name is the Shuva Brothers, SHUVA. And they've done incredible work, and it's entirely volunteer driven, and civilians will donate anything they need, from female hygiene products to food. Others will show up in kind and cook, so that there's hot food at all hours of the day, whether it's before they're going into Gaza, on the way back. There's shower facilities when they're covered in dust and so on. I mean, it's incredible and very inspirational in terms of the Israeli response.
Thanks, Kevin. Quentin, last thoughts?
Yeah, nothing really to add. I mean, those 5 kind of points are my observations from where we're there. I'm sure we'll get into a discussion about Hamas and genocide. That's probably going to come up at some point, and we can talk about targeting ROE and collateral damage estimates. But no, I think we'll leave it at that and go to the floor.
Thanks, Quentin. Well, Daniel Schumann has led the way by putting on the chat box that he has 2 points, and that's really all I can handle, because I will pass the floor over to Daniel after I ask my 1 question, and that's going to be directed to Cal. You talk about the 2-state solution. The Treaty of Montevideo of 1933 sets out 4 conditions for statehood. Palestine only has 1, territory. I suggest to you it lacks the governance, it lacks population, and it lacks the ability to have international legal personality. And most importantly, it lacks recognition from the other 100 and some odd states in the world community. And even if you look at a state like Taiwan, it is not recognized as a state, notwithstanding fulfilling all 4 conditions of the treaty. So it's just more than land, it's more than people, it's more than governance, and it's more than international legal personality. Cal, I think you're right. My question for Cal is, you mentioned that China may have an interest in Israel. Very briefly, can you describe what you think might be China's vital national interests in Israel? Or sorry, in that region?
Yeah,
Thanks.
I think it's a very good question. They have interests everywhere. You know, there's opportunities to get involved with building what they consider to be their national security in the world. And part of their national security is their reputation, and being involved in coming up with solutions, just in the same way that the Russians, you know, intervened in Syria and have been involved in a number of things in that part of the world as well. The Chinese are no less interested. So that's kind of what I see going on. I don't know if there's any information about, or at least I haven't seen any about them providing arms or doing anything like that. I don't know what the relationship with the Iranians is, which is an interesting question again. But wherever there's trouble in the world and opportunity, you're going to find the Chinese there. So I'm thinking that they are. And back to your notion about statehood, you know, certainly the de jure components of it that you're talking about are critical, but there's a de facto, and I know you know this, de facto component as well, which is if you're going to be a state in that part of the world, you're going to have to learn to live beside the Israelis, because they're not going anywhere. So if your manifesto calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, you know, the chances of you having any kind of a sustainable, or even beginning a state in that part of the world and having Israel stand by and allow it, let alone the United States and some others that have an interest in the future of the only democracy in the Middle East, I think you're going to have some challenges there.
I guess those in Kurdistan should take note. On that point, Daniel Schumann, you've led the way by pointing out you've got 2 points and questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I enjoyed all the presentations. Just to follow up Cal's point that the Israelis aren't going anywhere, Golda Meir's point was it's not just that they're not going anywhere, they have nowhere to go. And that's the secret weapon. And I'm speaking as a Jewish person who has been following this for 50 years. And from a Jewish perspective, and of course, it's not a monolith, but I would say the majority of Jews around the world, Jewish history, this resolve everybody talked about, even amongst Jews who are at each other's throats when it comes to this, is so deeply rooted, and it's increasingly rooted in a sense that a knowledge now that there's really no one in the world Jews can trust but themselves to defend themselves. And that's being buttressed right now powerfully here in Canada. There's 2 main reasons for the existence of Israel, and one of them is we need a state of our own to defend ourselves because no one else will. We're not safe anywhere else. And right now in Canada has alarmingly become a very unsafe country for Jews. They're being attacked way beyond free speech, as I think Kevin pointed out repeatedly. In Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal, it's not safe to be Jewish. And that's become known worldwide. And so paradoxically, and the failure of the Liberal, I'm not partisan, but the failure of the Trudeau government and so far the Carney government is that there hasn't been leadership to stand up and say this cannot happen in Canada. Not just words, but actions. And that's the Trudeau government, froze the bank accounts of the COVID protesting truckers. So that was a government that was willing, if it wanted to do some pretty severe domestic action against civil disobedience. And there's just stunning silence domestically here against really violent action against Jewish communities across the country, which paradoxically for Canadian policy is a further justification for Canadian Jews to support the existence of Israel. Because if we're not, it's just further buttressing that we're not safe anywhere but in our own country defending ourselves. And there are now Canadian Jews moving to Israel, which is seen as safer than Canada. So there's a conflict there in the Canadian political strategy and policy towards their domestic Jews and towards the state of Israel, which is it's generating. I don't think the contradiction that it's generating is realized or understood. And then the other thing that the Lebanese situation recently, Israel, if there is move towards any kind of even partial movement towards some kind of 2-state solution or 2 governance by the Palestinians, the issue for Israel, again, is an issue of who can be trusted as a third party to intermediate that. Lebanon is a stunning example. The UN peacekeepers were there, and what did Israel, the IDF, uncover? Incredible tunnel infrastructure, Hezbollah infrastructure, right up to and even under the Israeli border, ready to go, ready to commit way worse than October 7th, all constructed under the watchful eye of a UN peacekeeping mission that was there to ensure that didn't happen. So, anytime an Israeli now hears about any third party standing between the Palestinians and the Israelis and adjudicating a border, there's nobody to trust. So both my points are the same point. All latest events have done, both here domestically in Canada for Canadian Jews and at the Lebanese border, have just further intensified and buttressed the global Jewish and Israeli sense that we can only trust ourselves to defend ourselves. There is nobody else. So those are points, but of course it'd be interesting comments. But
Kevin, do you have a rejoinder, a rebuttal, or comment?
I have heard from Jews myself here in Toronto who, and I think it's important to emphasize that how much I think our leaders have failed Canadians, that they would feel safer in a country in the midst of an active war zone than here in Canada. And I think nothing hits home more that we have failed the previous government, and the new prime minister is not off to a great start. I think it's important, and then I'll circle back to the point made around statehood, that there were a number of individuals that signed the Vote Palestine platform during the general election. And two of the Liberal signatories are now cabinet ministers. One is president of the Treasury Board, the other one is Secretary of State for Sport. And within that is unilateral recognition of the Palestine state, which is in direct contradiction to our nation's official policy on the matter. And so I have trouble reconciling how these two individuals can be in cabinet while holding a position that does not reflect what this nation's official policy is. And I think that needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Kevin. Daniel, were things ever different, or have they always been the same? Jews have never had a safe haven. And I ask out of ignorance.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, so many of these questions are Zoom dependent. How far out do you zoom? How far in do you zoom? And the answer varies depending on your zoom. So you could say there were 300 years in Spain in the 1300s where Jews thrived. But then the Inquisition happened, equally as bad as the Holocaust. You could say France emancipated the Jews, you know, equal rights for all, you know, and then there was the Dreyfus affair and the whole, you know, so there have been definitely times over 2,000 years, sometimes 1-2 centuries long, where Jews were thriving and safe wherever they were. Okay. And then history taught that it's only a matter of time. And so if you zoom out to the full 2,000-year history, the answer is no. But if you can zoom into periods of time, and a lot of people like to zoom in on certain Muslim-dominated periods of the Mediterranean area and say Jews thrived under those times. But you just have to zoom out a little and the whole argument collapses.
Got it. Okay, thanks very much. I'm sure Quentin can read the chat box as easily as I can. But Karen was interested in the new curriculum for Palestinian students. But one of the obstacles is that it's not just the terrorist Hamas, but the radicalized Palestinian population as well. The question arises, what does it take to design and to implement a new curriculum to foster a more moderate approach for future generations in Palestine?
Maybe I'll start off since Karen addressed. It needs political will from the international donor community to actually hold their funding back if changes or reforms to the educational curriculum are not actually enacted. I mean, it is abundantly clear, and actually I actually read excerpts from the existing Palestinian curriculum in the House of Commons. They are laced with anti-Semitism. The individuals who they celebrate and glorify are literal terrorists. You know, the first person, you know, let's say, for example, we want to celebrate female leadership. We're going to talk about Viola Desmond or a number of prominent individuals. The individual that they celebrate is essentially the woman who pioneered the concept of taking hostage a plane and blowing it up. Like, these are the people that they glorify in their curriculum. And it is well known within the international donor community. And sure, they'll send some wires and say, this is not good. We don't want to see that. And yet continue to issue the checks and that fund the schools where they teach this. And so what you need, I think, is an international coalition. It will, I think, in order for there to be true social license, it will have to be Arab-led. And I think the signatories to the Abraham Accords, where they have already reformed their curriculum, whether you want to go to Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, there is existing curriculum. And if you want to stay closer to home within Jerusalem, where there's a reformed education curriculum for Palestinians already being taught there. But that will not happen unless there is real accountability. I think it's also important to note too that within the existing population, the impression that I had gotten from the individuals we spoke to within certain Israeli corners is that it's such a radicalized population now that any efforts towards de-radicalization, I think, will need to be attempted, but there is not much optimism that it's actually going to be effective in any way. So really the only hope, the true hope, is future generations and getting to them before they are taught to hate, before grade 1 Palestinian students are acting out like literal kidnappings of Jews. You know, I feel bad for the poor Palestinian child that needs to act the role of a Jew while the rest of their peers are marching about with fake pistols and AKs and roughing them about. But that's the education today, and that needs to change.
Okay. Kevin, thanks very much. Ian Gillen, you've got a very long text. Can you take the floor and summarize your question for Quentin? Ian?
Certainly. Is my microphone working?
It certainly is. The floor
Excellent,
is yours.
thanks.
The floor is yours.
Good evening. I'd first like to say just thank you to everyone for hosting this fascinating event where a civilian like myself can be kept usefully informed. Everyone involved really has my gratitude, and today's dialogue has really left me looking forward to future events. This is my first interaction with the community here, and I'm keen to volunteer at things like the July charity casino. Hopefully I can volunteer and take some of your cash for the group. Anyway, my question here. Following Quentin's compelling observation regarding the viability of traditional solutions for complex geopolitical disputes, particularly the two-state solution, I'm reminded of the profound challenges we face in Canada's own reconciliation journey concerning land and sovereignty. So beyond existing conventions like Montevideo, in these contexts, we see deeply held, often conflicting relationships to territory. As policymakers and experienced individuals, are there emerging conceptual frameworks, perhaps drawing inspiration from principle of things like two-eyed seeing, which seeks to integrate these diverse ways of knowing for shared stewardship of the land? Is there anything like this that could really help our defense policymakers and strategists reevaluate our national borders and shared spaces, reconceptualize these things and how we manage them in highly contested regions, especially when traditional paradigms do appear completely exhausted? Thank you.
Who wants that one? I
You do.
can start off with a couple observations. So the conception of ownership of land is different under Sharia than it is under Western law. So something like Jerusalem, for example, is a waqf. It's a kind of a collective cooperative ownership of land. And there's a council that runs Temple Mount or Sharif al-Haram as it's known in Arabic. But it doesn't have a concept of individual ownership of land the way that we do, as far as I can tell. And if you go back to before the Arab Rebellion in 1936, when the Zionists were first coming into Israel, and I'm going to step back one more before the First World War in a minute, what the Jewish community was doing, the Jewish agency was doing, was purchasing land to give to Jews to live in Palestine. So that land wasn't stolen, it was purchased. But the question is, who was it purchased from? And in a bunch of cases, it was purchased from absentee landowners. So you would have Palestinians who've been farming the land for generations, and an Israeli or Jewish person rocks up and says, hey, this is now my land. That's a bitter pill for them to swallow, because they didn't understand that they didn't have ownership of the land. They had use of the land. Stewardship, I think you used the word. And in Islamic law, quite often what you have, the relationship to the land, is one of stewardship, not one of ownership. If we go back before the First World War, so before the Balfour Declaration, and we go back to the discussions between Theodor Herzl and Yusuf Dia. Yusuf Dia was one of the senior Palestinian leadership. It was an informal leadership. His position was based on being mayor of Jerusalem at one point. And there was an exchange of letters between Herzl and Dia. And those letters are often quoted, sometimes out of context, as showing that Dia was actually supportive of the Zionist project. But I would argue that, having read the letters, they're in French because that was the language of diplomacy at the time. Having read those letters, I would argue that Dia's position was no more Jews in Palestine. And at that time, Jews were only 4% of the population of Palestine. And there was no concept of a Jewish state as such. There was an idea of a Jewish homeland. But you got to remember that in 1890, when Herzl and Dia were corresponding, that was still part of the Ottoman Empire. So any kind of Jewish project would have had to have had the blessing of the Caliph in Istanbul in order to proceed. So in that respect, a Jewish community in Palestine would have gone into Palestine under the millet system as it was at the time. It would have been a self-governing community, but it wouldn't have had traditional ownership of land the way that we think of it. And the kibbutz system is also a collective ownership. There's not if you live in a kibbutz, you don't own your house. The house is owned by the kibbutz, and you live in it, and you farm collective land. So there's a very different conception of land. I mean, you're absolutely right. You've hit on a very fundamental point here, which we probably need to delve into some more. But there's a very different conception of the ownership of land and who gets to use that land in that part of the world than what we're used to seeing. And with that, I'll hand over to Cal because I think he's got something to say on this one.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. I actually learned some stuff there, but I mean, what I think about is the facts on the ground where we are right now. And the facts on the ground where we are right now is you've got an Israel that isn't going anywhere. And you've got contested territories in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. And we're having a hard time trying to figure out, and we've tried a bunch of different ways to conceptualize this, about where we go from here. And what I think the most operative question is at this stage is the notion of a two-state solution, which again seems to be alive in the minds of the West, but not really in that part of the world. Is that something that's actually, in terms of how we're going to characterize land ownership, sharing land, and however we want to take a look at it, is there some way to make that operative in that part of the world in such a way that the Palestinians will find what they're looking for, and the Israelis are going to be fine with that and not see that their sovereignty and their future is being threatened? And that's a Rubik's Cube that I don't have an answer for. I don't think anybody else that I've heard speak about this or write it, or things that I've read about this, apart from some utopian thoughts about it, how that's actually going to look the day after Hamas is defeated, and are we going to get to a place where Hamas is defeated? That's another question, because even if you defeat them in a military sense, and we've talked about the political component of this and the governance component of this, but there's also the thought of it, the theory of it, the support of it amongst the population. Again, and it's not a mystery why Abbas never had an election after he won his first one, because he knew if he ran again, the same thing that happened in Gaza was going to happen to him in the West Bank. That's the reality that we have on the ground today. So I'd love to get to a place where we're actually having, thorough, sensitive, historically contextualized discussion about along the lines of what you were talking about, Quentin, and and what our discussant is discussing, or has mentioned, but we ain't there, and I'm not sure when we are going to get there. You know, the thing for me has always been, okay, so when does this end? And I'm not sure I really have a good idea what that looks like, and I'm not sure the Israelis do either. You know, I mean, I don't know what it looks like. I mean, is it killing the last Hamasnik in Gaza? Is that even possible? You know, at some point this thing needs to wind down, and I think that's the thing that you've heard it from all of us. I think that we struggle with. And then once that happens, I think all the interesting, creative, and far more, I would say, sympathetic kinds of things that we're talking about right now, I think they can kind of come into the play, but we ain't there yet.
I think it's important to acknowledge the limitations of trying to take how we approach things here and applying them over there. And I think a great example, in addition to what Quentin had shared, I saw in Lebanon, where they have this unique power sharing agreement amongst the three predominant faiths. Their prime minister is a Sunni Muslim. Their defense minister is a Druze. And their president is a Maronite Christian. Like, we would never do that here in Canada. Or most of the Western world, you know, it's not like, oh, prime minister has to be a Catholic, so, you know, someone else needs to be an Anglican and so on. And so I think it's important that as much as sometimes we wish, that I think it's important that we look at this region as it is, as opposed to how we wish it could be.
Good point. Right, Kevin, thank you very much. We're going to ignore the 8 o'clock deadline because Sarah Lapsley, excuse me, Sarah has been very patiently waiting. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just, wondered what you thought. I know it's been mentioned about, the protests happening across Canada, and it seems like there's such a emotion behind them, and extremism behind them, not only from maybe affiliated terror groups, but from regular citizens that have taken this on and in a very profound way. And it's causing a lot of disruption. And as well in our institutions, you mentioned the government is kind of leaning pro-Palestinian. Just wondered what you thought about how we could effectively advocate. It feels like it's an unpopular opinion to support Israel right now. At the same time, we know Jewish people across Canada are feeling afraid. All those wounds are reopening from so many years of exile and persecution. So, yeah, wondered your thoughts.
Quentin.
I could probably take that one. This is one I've puzzled over a lot because I've had a lot of discussions with Muslim friends of mine about this whole thing. And I kind of like to go back to first principles, and I'll go back to something Daniel said, which is that Jews can only count on each other for protection. I think that there's really three questions you have to ask yourself when you're looking at this. The first question is there a requirement for a Jewish state? And by a Jewish state, I mean a state where anybody of the Jewish faith, no matter where they're born or where they currently reside, can claim citizenship. So in that sense, Israel is a sanctuary state. The second question is, if there is a requirement for a Jewish state, where should it be? And the third question is, if the Jewish state should be in the Middle East, what are its borders? And I'm going to unpack this one for a little bit more here, because there's a couple of things that fall out of this. The first one is that if you accept that there is a requirement for a Jewish state, then that means that the purpose of the Jewish state is protecting Jews. And this is why you're getting such a huge emotional response in Israel to the events of October 7th, because it's similar to the Yom Kippur War in 73, where Israel was almost overrun. The Yom Kippur War was a very, very near run thing. And Israel was almost overrun particularly from the north by the Syrians. The second point that kind of falls out of that is that if you accept that there should be a Jewish state and you accept that it should be in the Middle East, then the border issue becomes important. And one of the things that I didn't understand about Israel up until about 2007, 2008, when I started looking at topographical maps, is that the borders that were defined by UN Resolution 181, which defined, that was the resolution that split up Palestine into predominantly Jewish and predominantly Muslim areas, those borders are indefensible. So, my friend who works in Ramallah with the Palestinian Authority, her argument about the Israelis is always everything in Israel comes down to security. And the answer is yes, it does. Because the whole reason for the existence of the state of Israel is to provide security for Jewish people. And the reason that the Israelis need their borders is because they live in a hostile part of the world, and the borders that were assigned to them under Resolution 181 are indefensible. So that's why Israel needs the Golan Heights. This is why the Israelis are so adamant about southern Lebanon up to the Litani River, because those mountains in Lebanon overlook the northern part of the Jordan Valley. This is why the Israelis were willing to give land back to Egypt, because they can trade space for time in the Gaza, but they can't trade space for time on the Golan or Lebanon, or in fact, in the West Bank. So the fundamental is sort of those three questions. And whenever I'm engaging with people that are pro-Palestinian, and I bring it down to those questions, nobody really wants to address that. Nobody wants to say, well, there shouldn't be a Jewish state. They get hung up on that one. And then the last little while, I started taking it one step further and said, okay, let's play the game to the end. So the Palestinians in 2021 held what they called the Conference on the Hereafter. And this was their conference where they sat down and decided what was going to happen to Israel once they overthrew Israel. And their argument was that they would take Israel and they would establish a Palestinian state in what used to be Israel, and life would be good. I think there's some language in there about which Israelis get to be killed and which Israelis get to be enslaved by the new state. But there's some details to be worked out. But here's the point: the idea of a Palestinian state is a bit of a pipe dream, because even if Israel ceased to exist tomorrow, the next thing that would happen is that Hamas and Fatah would fight it out, because Hamas is predominantly Sunni hardline fundamentalist, and Fatah is a secular organization, descends from the PLO, which was a left-wing socialist secular organization. Once Hamas and Fatah have fought it out, then Hezbollah would take on the winner, because Hezbollah has a mission to take Jerusalem for the Iranians as part of the Shia community. But even once that happened, Jordan would then reassert its claim to the West Bank and Jerusalem. Egypt would reassert its claim to the southern part of what is now Israel. And Syria would reassert its claim to the Golan Heights and possibly the area in the Jordan River Valley. So the bottom line is the Palestinians are not going to get an independent state, even if Israel ceases to exist tomorrow. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cal, because now I'm verging into the realpolitik of the situation on the ground.
Yeah, thanks, Quentin. I'm not going to address that so much. I'm going to maybe sort of a reattack on the question, which was, what's happening on our streets, and as a Jew, I see this, and I've seen it for a long time, and I'll tell you what I think really has happened here, and it's a Western mostly a Western phenomenon. And it's been driven by a couple of things. One is immigration, but that's not the primary driver. I can tell you, when I was a professor at the University of Calgary in the late '80s, I couldn't walk two signposts at the University of Calgary and not see a Zionism is racism sign. This was going on inside the departments, particularly in the humanities, in universities, and has been forever. Okay, and I won't get into all of it, yeah, but I'm happy to address it for anybody that wants to talk about it after. It's a phenomenon of phenomenology and neo-Marxism and how it all kind of came together in the academy. And it became the lingua franca. It became the only way of thinking about things. And so if you want to talk about critical theory and you want to talk about all those kinds of things, that's what gets promoted, that's what gets rewarded, that's what gets taught. And if you actually take that to its logical conclusion, you get into this whole oppressor and the oppressed and victimology lived experience thing, which I'd be happy to address for anybody that wants to talk about it. And the ultimate oppressor, the ultimate colonizer is the Jew, right? That's how they see it. And this has been pushed through every department you can think of in the humanities. And it's what you read on the signs. It's what you hear in the chants. It's what you hear if you go to the University of Toronto and see the encampment. And it's not just the universities, it's the unions, okay? And we can go through, it's certain sections of the media and we can go through it all. Okay, but the one group of people that you can say anything, do anything about, and commit any kind of, atrocity against, and you're not going to be criticized in those places is Jews. Okay, I saw it when I was there. It's one of the reasons I'm not an academic anymore. Okay, I'm one of the only Jewish guys you're ever going to meet in the military, by the way. But there's a few of us, not a lot. I felt that keenly for many, many years. And what's happened now is you're seeing it in front of you. It's no longer on the campus. It's in front of you, and you're seeing it every weekend at Young and Bloor. And those are the people. Go around and take a look at who they are, right? And that's what we need to fight against. And it starts with law enforcement. It starts with government turning its back on it. And that's not happening in the city of Toronto. And it's not happening in a bunch of other places in this country right now. So do Jews feel terrified in Canada? I'm quite sure that many do. Okay, I don't. I still have hope for this country. And I've been trained by the military, so they can give me a shot if they want. As has Kevin, as has Quentin. Well, you're not Jewish, but my view is we can't surrender here. Mm-hmm. We need to change the dialogue. We need to face this stuff down. We need to elect people that are not going to abide by it, and we need to call it out when it happens. But don't think it's new. It's not. This has been going on for quite a while. You're only seeing it now because you weren't in the academy. Well, maybe you were in the academy at the time, but if you were in the academy at the time, you would have seen it. The nascent tentacles that have created all this were all there at the time, and they're just now bubbling out into the mainstream. Would be my thoughts on it.
I think we need to reframe the issue away from the conflict and simply focus on the fact that these are our Canadian values that are under threat. And, yes, there's a right to peaceful assembly, but that does not mean that you have a right to be able to infringe on mine. No one has a right to infringe on others' rights. And what we've seen has been the abuse and exploitation of our right of freedom of expression to express things that actually are inciting violence, the glorification of terrorism. And what I think we've seen have been, for example, if something is in contravention of our laws related to hate speech, it's section 361 of the criminal code, in case anyone's interested, there's a higher threshold. Our local police of jurisdiction can't just lay that charge. It needs to be signed off by the provincial or territorial attorney generals. And they do the same math, and most have decided not to. And over time, while law enforcement does not get direction from politicians, they sure get signals. And signals have been sent, and this is definitely the case, unfortunately, in the city of Toronto, where the mayor's office does not want to see any charges laid. And this is where the federal government has a role. I don't think it's fair to be left to local police of jurisdiction. I I think it's important to have a national standard applied in terms of what is in violation of that section of the criminal code, to be able to come out and determine as a nation, and this is the role for the Attorney General. I had advocated for this in the previous Parliament. Hopefully the next, our new one will be better. And Sean Fraser sees the opportunity to demonstrate some leadership, to say very clearly what might cross that threshold into criminality, into the higher threshold of Section 361. So then the provinces and the territories can go forward accordingly. I don't think it's fair, and I experienced this firsthand when my pregnant wife was stalked and we were followed in our home. When we called the Sergeant Arms, RCMP, and Toronto Police sent over a cruiser and officers to investigate, we got the license plate and the person who was following us in the vehicle. But the police went and they were told some cockamamie story about, oh, they thought we were lost. It was daytime. We had our phones. They'd even ask us if we were lost. But they don't have the bandwidth nor the expertise to be able to prosecute this accordingly. And so that is why there needs to be national leadership. And I think the final thing that I'll say around why I think it needs to be federal leadership is because we saw this on the campuses. In Alberta, you guys were better, but across multiple Toronto campuses, when they took over the University of Toronto, they all had the same tents, brand new, same color. These are foreign influence operations. And there is a moral and national security imperative for the federal government to act and get involved. And so there's a number of lenses to approach this from. And I think in order to get buy-in from the broader Canadians who aren't familiar with the issue, who aren't feeling it intimately, who may not be allies of the Jewish community, who may not know people within the community, to reframe it away from a conflict that's 8,000 kilometers away, and focus on how it is impacting Canadians, and that is a defense of Canadian values.
All right, I would like to, noting the time, it's 8:15. Obviously, you want to go home, but I hope you'll hang around. Daniel raised the question at 8:03, or raised the concept of self-determination. And in international law, thank you, Daniel, in international law, self-determination is a human right. But Daniel very interestingly said the self-determination of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people are not a subject of international law, they're an object of international law. But I think in 1947, when the Jewish state was stood up, correct me if I'm wrong on the date, then Israel became a subject of international law. And it satisfied all the criteria of the Montevideo Convention, And so did South Sudan very quickly in 2005-06. South Sudan went from a nobody to they've got a seat at the UN General Assembly, as did many of the states after the breakup of Yugoslavia. So what is missing in this dialogue? Why can't the Palestinians do what everybody else seems to be doing, going from exercising a right of self-determination, which I respectfully argue everybody's entitled to a meaningful statehood? There's something missing in the process. I don't know what it is, and maybe the answer lies somewhere in sociology. Daniel, you've got the answer. Maybe the answer lies somewhere in sociology or social anthropology. I don't know. I'm a stranger to that. But Daniel, the floor is yours.
Well, this may obviously come across as terribly biased, but Einat Wilf, who I admire greatly, makes the point that presently too much, and I want only the best for the Palestinian Arabs. I really do wish they could get it together and that the world could help them. But too much of their identity is too wrapped up now in obliterating the Jews. And you can't sustain an identity when that's a large predicate of the identity. The identity has to be a thing in itself, not in getting rid of someone else.
Got it. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Daniel, I think I'll invite you onto the board of RAUSI. You can run, but you can't hide.
I've got I got a comment on that one as well, and I put it in the chat that Kevin said the L word, which is leadership. And fundamentally, one of the conclusions I've come to in all the reading I've done over the last 2 years is that the Palestinian leadership does not and will not accept the existence of the state of Israel. But the problem goes deeper than that. It's not just it's not the existence of Israel, it's the presence of Jews. So when you talk to Jews you talk to Arabs on Temple Mount, and they talk about the idea that Jews being on Temple Mount is a desecration of Haram al-Sharif. You know, these are deep-seated kind of religious beliefs that these people have. And until the leaders of those groups of people, those societies, decide to change, nothing's going to change. Mm-hmm. I can give you 3 little anecdotes. First one, Daniel, speaks to your point about fear. I was in a coffee shop in St. Albert. I live in St. Albert. We call St. Albert the bubble. It's the sort of upper middle class, suburban paradise, right? And I ran into a lady who overheard our conversation about going to Israel, and she mentioned that her daughter had just transferred from University of Alberta to Tel Aviv because she no longer felt safe going to university in Alberta. So that's kind of data point 1. Data point 2 is a conversation I had with a taxi driver who told me that he would die of thirst before he drank Jewish water. That level of disdain just permeates, right? And then data point 3 is a conversation I had with a guy in Old Jerusalem, Palestinian, owned a shop, been there his whole life. His mother lived in Old Jerusalem. He now lived in East Jerusalem. But he told me about his kids. His kids, he educated in Hebrew. And they went to the university in Jerusalem. I think it's called Hebrew University, isn't it? Cal, correct me if I'm wrong. But his kids speak Hebrew and were educated in Hebrew. So I think, the situation as it is right now, people are scared. Is there hope for the future? I think a lot of this depends on sort of applying the model of change's 3 steps, which basically is where are we now, where do we want to be, and then how do we get there? And the people who have to define the where do we want to be, that has to be the leadership. And the people who have to lay out the path for how we get there, again, that has to be the leadership. And I think the fundamental problem, or I shouldn't say the fundamental problem, the most pressing problem right now is that there isn't the leadership in that part of the world that wants to lay out the path to get to that future state.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that the existing leadership, say of Hamas, isn't even in Gaza, right? They continue to provide direction from their 6-star hotels. I didn't even know that existed, in Qatar, in safety, in luxury. I see in the comments Ian talk, this allegation that there's a lack of Palestinian leadership because of the CIA and Mossad, in his words. Well, there have been tribal leadership within Gaza who has tried to rise to the occasion. Hamas kills them. There have been anti-Hamas resistance groups that have tried to rise and try to chart and forge a different path forward, and Hamas kills them. There's another effort right now, and I hope that they are successful. And part of that will entail various international donor communities putting actual pressure and holding the existing institutions to account if they want to continue to work within that framework, within the international development community, with those partners there, knowing that there are issues, and go in eyes wide open. Because otherwise they continue to perpetuate and propagate the existing failed leadership, which is Hamas, whose interest is not what's best for the Palestinian people, but that of their leadership and continuing to propagate their mission of destroying Israel and killing all the Jews.
All right. It's 20 after 8. Are we done, or are there any pressing questions that we would like to? Yes, Quentin.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Ian's other question. Good
sorry.
point about Mossad and Hamas killing off, the moderate Palestinian leadership. And I did have that debate with one of my historian friends. We talked about the Arab Rebellion 36 to 39, when a lot of the leadership was killed off or rounded up by the Brits. But the issue really predates even the existence of Hamas, of Hamas. It predates the existence of Mossad and the CIA. It goes back to the 1890s. And I don't know where the shift arrived in the Arab world, because if you go back to the original Arab Empire, the expansion of the Arab Empire in the 600s, 700s, when they first came to Jerusalem, Jerusalem was a Christian city. All the Jews had been kicked out. And when the Arabs came in and conquered Jerusalem, and took Jerusalem, they insisted that Jewish families be moved back into Jerusalem. They thought this was blasphemy, that Jews weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem. And even at the end of the Crusader kingdoms in 1100, 1200, the Jews sided, with the Arabs against the Christians, against the Crusaders, because they'd been so poorly treated by the Crusaders. So there was an entente cordiale between the Jewish community and the Muslim community, notwithstanding what Muhammad did to the three Arab Jewish tribes that lived outside Medina. But there was a cooperation between Jews and Arabs, and I'm not sure where that went off the rails. But I would argue that it predates the existence of the state of Israel, and that's why I say things like it's not the existence of Israel; it's the presence of Jews. And then, Ian, to your other point about, I've been mulling this one over, the propaganda of video games and can we not use that to reframe the narrative? So in other words, when Kevin's talking about the educational training aids that are used in Palestinian schools that use examples of working out trajectories of rockets as a physics problem, could we not take that technology that is so persuasive and use it for good? Could we not tell the stories of Jewish and Muslim cooperation back in the 700s, back in the 1200s? Could we not use that to discount some of the propaganda that's out there in the Muslim world right now? And with that, I'll hand off to Cal because he's got his hand up.
So, I mean, my I guess a response to that would be to suggest that there's a moderate Palestinian leadership or leadership in we can talk about the Houthis, or we can talk about Iran, we can talk about a bunch of different places, would be, to kind of contest the law of gravity. That's not what's winning in those communities. What's winning in those communities are the most radical members of those communities who next seek to depose the people that are less radical than they are and kill them. We saw it happen in Gaza when Hamas took over in 2006. And Fatah's, honestly, not that much less radical. They're less radical by comparison to Hamas, but when you take a look at the rhetoric and the actions of Fatah, it's basically a distinction without a difference. And so I think we all yearn for the day when we would find the kind of leadership that people are thinking about, kind of rising to the top in those communities, but it hasn't happened. And I'm not sure that we can make it happen. It needs to happen on its own. And until that kind of behavior gets rewarded in those communities, we're going to be facing the same thing that we're facing. And I actually fear that it's going to get worse. I think that what we're going to find is that in a number of communities, well, I mean, Syria is an example. We'll see what happens. I know everybody thinks that the current leadership there is a moderate group of folks, but we didn't see it. It didn't take very long for the Alawites to get in the way and get murdered a few weeks ago. So we'll see. But I'm a believer in strong borders make for good friends, and I think that Israel's best. My best advice to Israel, if they'd ever ask it, is to keep that in mind, because if they're waiting, or anybody in the West, particularly the proponents of the two-state solution, are waiting for this moderate leadership to emerge, I haven't seen it yet.
All right, I would like to ask what may be the last question of the evening to Quentin. Looking at what I see on television, and thinking of the principles of the law of the conduct of war, namely distinction, military necessity, and proportionality. In your discussions with members of the IDF and with civilians writ large, do you get a sense of is the apparent lack of distinction, lack of military necessity, and lack of proportionality, is that an issue or that's ignored, or is it an issue that can be satisfactorily addressed?
It's a tough question, and what it does, you've covered a bunch of topics here, but basically what you're talking about is the targeting cycle. And targeting is not something that is well understood even within the military, never mind civilian communities. But I always start, when I talk about targeting to people, I always start with the idea that the purpose of the targeting cycle is to reduce collateral damage. And when we talk about collateral damage, what we mean is not just deaths of non-combatants, but also destruction of infrastructure. So the example I use is the RAF raid on the dams in Germany during the Second World War, where they killed 40,000 German civilians downstream of those dams. But the decision was made that the military effect of destroying those dams was worth the risk of the deaths of the civilians. So targeting is something that evolved out of sort of World War II practice. It's become very, very formalized in a targeting cycle. And the targeting cycle spits out what we call a collateral damage estimate. And the collateral damage estimate has to address the damage that will be caused by attacking a particular target, both in terms of deaths of non-combatants. And I use the term non-combatants, not civilians, because non-combatant is the more correct term here.
Yeah.
And damage to infrastructure. So if the Hamas leadership is having a meeting in a mosque next to an orphanage, down the road from a hospital, when you do the targeting cycle, you have to be able to demonstrate that the military effect that you're going to achieve by targeting that mosque is worth the three elements of collateral damage that you're going to sustain. First off, you're destroying a religious institution, the infrastructure piece. Secondly, you're killing a bunch of kids, potentially killing a bunch of kids in an orphanage. And thirdly, you may involve the hospital. So the military effect that you achieve has to be proportionally, it has to be important enough to justify the damage that you're going to do in achieving that effect. That's basically the principle of it. Now, how that plays out, when we were in Lebanon, on the Lebanese border, I asked the question about targeting in Lebanon, and I was told that all of the targeting was being done in Tel Aviv. So the target was proposed and the decision was made in Tel Aviv. Now they can do that in Lebanon because it's a different environment. You're sitting behind a border. You're talking about relatively discrete, isolated targets. It's the area between the Israeli border and the Litani River is not very built up. It's forested and it's hilly, and the communities are small and relatively isolated. So they're able to take their time and go through a full targeting cycle and look at the collateral damage and the effects. So you'll see that there's far less media play about what went on in Lebanon than there is about what has been going on and is going on in Gaza. In Gaza, I think what happened, I couldn't get anybody to confirm this, but I think what happened is that the authority to accept collateral damage was pushed down to division, brigade, or even battalion level. So brigade and battalion commanders were getting briefed by their targeteers, and they're saying, okay, we have this target, we can attack it, but here's the collateral damage that may ensue. And the battalion and brigade commanders, divisional commanders, had been given the authority to accept that collateral damage, probably up to a certain limit. In Afghanistan, we had authority at different levels. So a 1-star could accept so many civilian deaths, A two-star could accept so many civilian deaths. And that was part of a very, very formalized targeting cycle. It's probably happening much quicker in Gaza. It's probably happening, the authority has probably been delegated lower in Gaza. And that's why you're seeing the scale of destruction that you're seeing in Gaza. The other part of it is that because the terrain is different, it's the scale of destruction is far more obvious in Gaza than it is in Lebanon. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but kind of frames the debate.
Well, you answered what would have been my follow-up question. How is it quantified? Great principles. Thank you very much. But this has all got to go in some Excel spreadsheet with numbers. And what you're saying is, it's at the end of the day, it's not deaths of non-combatants.
Yeah, and the actual numbers are going to be secret. When we did our targeting cycle, they were.
Got it.
And I'm sure the Israelis are the same way. And everybody I pressed, everyone we talked to pretty well. Kevin and Cal will roll their eyes at this one, but every time we talked to or briefed by an Israeli defense official, I brought up the targeting cycle and how they were doing it. But they're never going to tell you what their numbers are. In broad strokes, that's how they conduct that targeting cycle, but the specifics of it are going to be secret.
And begging on, how are those metrics even developed in the first place? Who defines the threshold, whatever that threshold is? Not an easy job.
It's not. It's a very tough job, and as I said, the principle of distinction has to be applied because, the military force is supposed to be used against military objectives for military purposes.
Yeah.
When you're fighting in an urban environment, that gets very confusing very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to point out when you're fighting a terrorist group that has no issue militarizing civilian infrastructure. One of the data points that really stuck with me from the Israelis was on the northern front, they expected that Hezbollah would have militarized 1 in 3 homes. And what they found was that nearly every home had stores of various munitions, rockets, and so on. And one of the questions that we had was that sometimes Hezbollah would just come and be like, "Hey, you wanna expand your home, as we would with a home reno? No problem, we'll pay for it, but we're also going to add this room. You just don't look in there." And it's hard for us, I think, as people in the West, as Canadians, where that is not what we do. Our professional military does not do these things. And I think it's important to acknowledge the limitations of kind of our values and our approach to a region where they're operating with very different parameters and a very different value set.
Yeah. I believe, is that not the war crime of perfidy? I believe.
Yeah, there's perfidy is interesting. It's sort of the classic perfidy is coming out under a white flag and then fighting, right? But the distinction is about infrastructure. So infrastructure is a lawful target if it's being used for a military purpose. So even a hospital can lose its protected status if it's being used for a military purpose. And this is the argument that the Israelis make. The argument is that the Hezbollah, Hamas is using hospitals in Gaza as command centers and logistics centers and so on. And that's going to happen. I mean, the other reality of life is that the Israeli army is a conventional army trying to operate under international humanitarian law. Hamas and Hezbollah are guerrilla organizations that frankly aren't bound by international humanitarian law. So playing devil's advocate here, if the Americans invaded Canada, how many Canadian basements would suddenly turn into storehouses for mortars and anti-tank rockets?
Yeah, well, I guess it gives new meaning to the term dual purpose infrastructure. Look, we're past 8:30. Ian Gillen, you've got the last question. Can you please make it short? Thank you. Ian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I just wanted to ask then, with the example of the Iraqi playing war cards, which I just looked into myself to sort of answer my own question, but from that example, what kind of systems would you think might work in terms of getting the Iraqi population on board, especially tying into what we were talking about with video games and ideas like that, spectacle, things that make people invested in intelligence gathering, right? What kind of things would you guys expect in that sort of arena? Thank you.
Yeah, Ian, I'm not sure what the question is. Is the question, because the Iraqi playing cards are mostly about intelligence gathering, right? So, and the discussion we were having about video games and everything else was about propaganda and re-educating the public. So to answer your question about the cards, that's mostly about intelligence gathering. It's about making sure the troops are aware of what they need to see and what they need to report on. The question about the video games and getting people invested in a different kind of future, that one I find, quite intriguing because, could you market a game whereby it was a role-playing video game, and it was a video game whereby an Arab child, first-person video game. So you're playing an Arab child, and you get involved in a car accident, and you get taken to a hospital that's run by Jews. And all of a sudden, these Jews, instead of being these satanic figures with peaked noses doing experiments on you, they actually put you back together again. And then so through the course of this video game, you have this positive experience with this group of Jews.
Absolutely. I get exactly what you're talking about there. So to follow on that concept, a video game was just released the other day. The game is called Roadcraft. It focuses entirely on disaster reconstruction. Following on your example, the game is basically built around collaborating with friends in order to utilize everything from a rusty backhoe to the most cutting edge cranes and sophisticated amphibious equipment. What if Israel simply took this concept of the game, colored every single vehicle with United Nations decals, etc., whatever they wanted to do, and then released it to the Palestinians, whereby you can play this game to rebuild your community, but this game is given to you by the by the Israeli state, and it features Israeli and UN and American equipment that they're used to seeing, like you were saying. Typically, it's demonized. That sounds like a good concept to me, following on from your idea.
Yeah, I think right now they wouldn't accept it because the Palestinians that I talked to, with very few exceptions, I pushed around the idea of identity, right? Like, what is the identity? Do you identify as Palestinian? Do you identify as Israeli? Do you identify as Muslim? For the most part, they identify as Palestinian. They travel on Jordanian passports. They have an Israeli ID if they live in Jerusalem. But Palestinian cars have a different license plate than Israeli cars. And on the West Bank, there's something like 800 checkpoints right now, manned by 19-year-olds. And the checkpoints can open and close at random intervals. You can get stuck behind a checkpoint for 6 hours, and you're never told why. So there's a level of frustration amongst the Palestinians that really has to be overcome. But I love the idea of a video game that's about reconstruction. And I wonder if General Mattis is behind this, because this was one of his key points when I was in Latvia. He was talking about resiliency in the civilian population. How do you make a civilian population resilient? And we in North America have this whole idea that when the world collapses, it'll be the rugged individualists that win out. And in fact, that's not what happens. When there's a crisis, when there's a natural disaster, the people that are most useful are the people who already have the networks, already have the bonds with their neighbors, and are willing to lend their chainsaw and willing to lend their generator to get society up and running again. So I think the idea of a video game as a journey from disaster to rebuilding, I think that's got a huge amount of potential. I just think you'd have to be very, very careful about how you marketed it. And I think if it was obvious that it came from the Israelis, the Palestinians on principle would discount it.
Well, maybe if it came from RAUSI as a new product line, we might just have a something to leverage. And as Jeff Daly says, this is a PSYOPs discussion. Look, I'm going to call it a night here. It's 8:42. It's time for some people to go to bed. So I want to say thank you very much. This has been, on a scale of 1 to 10, way off the scale. Simply outstanding. And I think one of the reasons for our success is we had 3 speakers. And I'm going to try in the future to make sure there are at least 2 talking heads on every RAUSI presentation. That way we can get some friction, and it's called leverage. And I'm a big fan of leverage and opportunity. So before we go, each of you have a job. Get a pen, write it down. You will show up on Thursday, the 19th of June at 2025 at 1900 hours Mountain Time to hear RAUSI's next new product line called the Briefing Room. We will be hosting a guy called Vas Padovovich, whose the presentation is called Russia's Holy War, Weaponizing Faith. Now you got to admit, that's pretty cool. And that's a lot more exciting than how many tanks are in a independent tank regiment or whatever. So on that note, thank you very much. I've written down 3 names. I will not tell you who they are, but I will be reaching out to you guys to say thank you very much for your input this evening. And please have a great night. And I look forward to seeing you again on the 19th of June. Feel free to write me, president@rausi.org, if you got any problems, complaints, or suggestions. I'm open-minded all the time. That concludes the evening. Take care. Drive safely.
Take care. Go Oilers.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check on the game.
All right.
Take
See
care,
you
guys.
later.